Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Welcome to AB 1938 From Policy to Practice, ensuring full language access for California's deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind students. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Nancy Leibach-Amon. I am the Director of State Special Schools and Services Division at the California Department of Education. I would like to introduce my other colleague here to join me on screen.
Hello, everyone. I think, okay, great. Thank you, Nancy, Dr. Leibach Aman. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dr. Rachel Heenan, and I serve as the Director of the Special Ed Division at the California Department of Education. So our division works closely with LEAs, SELPAs, and partners across the state to support the implementation of special education policy and to strengthen our systems that improve outcomes for students with disabilities. I'm not quite there yet on the slide, so hang tight. We also work collaboratively across divisions, including our state special schools, our multilingual services division, and our early ed divisions to ensure that students with all abilities and needs have access to the supports and services that allow them to thrive. So today I'll begin with a brief overview of Assembly Bill, we call it AB for short, 1938, and the related Ed Code provisions before we transition to practical implications for teams. And that'll be led by Dr. Leibach Aman. And through this webinar, we'll try to provide you with most of the answers of the questions you may have, but know you can always reach out to us after if you still have more questions. And then we'll close with a brief check for understanding, a nice quick poll, and of some of the key points of the webinar. And again, provide contact information if you have more questions. So the first slide of the webinar objectives is really understanding what AB 1938 and the policy framework looks like. Today's session is really grounded in this Assembly Bill. And again, we say AB for short. And really to understand the broader policy framework around education in California. So we'll reference this policy briefed by James Gallagher, and you'll see the name Gallagher up there. And it was introduced September 3rd, 2024, entitled Special Education, Inclusion, and Universal Design for Learning. So the goal of that bill was truly to connect policy to practice and helping practitioners understand how California's directive toward inclusive education and UDL supports improved outcomes for all students with disabilities, and really looking at the unique needs of our students who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. AB 1938 reinforces expectations that students with disabilities should have meaningful access to general education curriculum and environments whenever appropriate. But it also calls out, like I said, the unique needs for students who are deaf, hard of hearing, deaf, or deafblind. We'll also review the requirements of California Education Code 56040.6, which focuses on inclusive educational practices and service delivery, and what that means for the unique populations that we have in California. And that statute emphasizes the importance of access to settings and collaboration between general and special education teachers to meet the unique needs of all students. So participants should leave here today with a clear understanding of how this Ed code or this education code informs IEP team decision-making and placement considerations. We'll also discuss how LEAs can ensure that local policies, procedures, and service models align with statutory expectations. Now remember, inclusive education must be implemented in ways that recognize the unique communication and accessibility needs of students who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. And it includes considerations related to language access, communication modalities, the use of assistive technology, and specialized instructional supports. And remember, the goal is that our students have full access to instruction, to peer interaction, and communication within the classroom environment. So we'll discuss how IEP teams and educational systems can ensure inclusion in both meaningful and accessible ways for our student populations. Another objective for today's webinar is to help participants reflect on current practices within their local school settings or local school systems. So we encourage our LEAs and SELPAs to consider questions such as, are our practices aligned with state and federal requirements? Are students receiving appropriate supports and students in the appropriate settings? And are we ensuring equitable access and communication supports for all students? And are we looking at the unique needs of all our students? So this reflection is critical to ensure that policies translate into implementation and practice at the local level. Finally, we want our participants to walk away with practical strategies they can apply within their local context. This includes identifying ways to strengthen collaboration among LEAs, county offices, charter schools, and SELPAs. We'll discuss implementation considerations, resources, practices that support the alignment of AB 1938 and now the Ed Code requirements. So our ultimate goal is to ensure that systems are equipped to support all students and lead to better outcomes for students with disabilities across California. So our goal is simply to frame our learning from policy to understanding to evaluation and then implementation. So next slide, please. So this slide, and I know it's a lot of language, so I will let you go ahead and read it. I will not read all the language here, but the slides will be made available to you afterwards. But it highlights the language from AB 1938 and James Gallagher's policy brief on special education. And the legislation reinforces California's commitment to inclusive education while ensuring the unique needs of student populations are addressed. So let me reiterate, the laws and indicators regarding LRE and the requirements are still the same. But our focus must really be on the unique needs of each student. In particular, the focus for students who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf-blind, we must ensure there's full language access, and the needs are considered within education initiatives specific to these students. One of the most important components of this bill is the requirement for school districts, county offices, and charter schools to consider a full language access needs of students. And language access goes beyond simple accommodation. It includes ensuring that all students have meaningful access to instruction, to communication with peers, and to interaction with the learning environment. So this may involve considerations such as communication modalities, the use of qualified interpreters, the use of assistive technology, and direct language models for our students. The bill also reinforces the responsibilities of IFSP teams and IEP teams. So when determining least restrictive environment, teams must explicitly consider the language and communication needs of our deaf and hard of hearing students and our deaf and blind students. It ensures that placement decisions are not solely based on physical location. LRE is not the same for all students. And we have to look at whether the environment supports full communication access and meaningful participation. The legislation also encourages teams to review the range of support and services and placement options available to meet our students' needs. It's intended to ensure that students who have access to appropriate instructional settings and specialized supports when needed, and it is still prioritizing the I in individualized education program. And finally, the bill assigns responsibility to the California Department of Education to communicate these requirements statewide. It includes us notifying LEAs, county offices, charter schools, SELPAs, certified non-public schools, as well as our California's for the schools for the deaf and the blind of these requirements. And the goal is to ensure consistent understanding and implementation of these provisions across California's educational system. So ultimately, Assembly Bill 1938 reinforces that inclusive education must be implemented in ways to ensure that our students who are deaf, hard of hearing, deafblind, or blind have full access to language, communication, peers, and meaningful learning. Next slide. So before we move deeper into the requirements, I want to start with just a brief overview and why it matters for our work across California. The legislation strengthens how our schools consider language access and communication needs for our students who are deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind. So what's new is that Assembly Bill 1938 established a new California law effective in 2025 that required schools to explicitly consider the full language and communication needs of students. It applies to children and youth from birth to age 22, which it means it affects early intervention, K-12 programs, and transition-age youth. The law emphasizes that language access must be a central consideration in educational planning and not an afterthought. The law impacts a broad range of stakeholders or educational partners from our system. It includes that families, educators, administrators, LEAs, SELPAs, and charter schools are all in this together because decisions about services and placement occur within systems, and everyone is involved in supporting our students must understand the requirements of this legislation. So the overarching goal is to promote settings to ensure our students have meaningful access while they're in school. The law aligns to both state and federal special education requirements, particularly around least restrictive environment, or we call it LRE, and also viewing LRE from the unique needs of each and every child. So the intent is to ensure that students participate in inclusive environments but are receiving the specialized supports they need to access learning in whatever setting the IEP team determines. So AB 1938 places particular emphasis, like I said, on communication access to make sure our students have direct communication with peers and teachers, which is essential for both academic learning and social development. The legislation also reinforces the importance of family input in decision making, and I can't underscore that component. Finally, it reminds us that IEP teams that least restrictive environment decisions need to be considered from multiple perspectives, particularly including the language access and communication needs of our students. And as we move forward, we'll take a quicker look at how these requirements translate into practice and what they mean for IEP teams, educators, and local systems implementing education. So next slide, please. So this slide shows the actual statutory language added to the California Ed Code section 56040.6. And rather than reading the text, if you could go ahead and hit the button to move the text up. Just keep going. Thank you. I just want to highlight what this means in practice. And again, the purpose of me providing this much text on a slide is so you can actually go back and refer to now what the law says, the education code. And simply, again, this law was called the Universal Design for Learning and Inclusion, and it must align with both state and federal standards. So a central requirement, again, is considering the unique needs of all our students, including language needs, and includes the student's preferred language or communication mode. What is the student's preferred language or communication mode? It includes opportunities for direct communication with peers and educators, and access to instruction in the student's language or communication style. The goal is to ensure that students aren't just physically included, but meaningfully able to participate and communicate in their learning environment. So the law also stresses the importance of direct communication with peers and professionals who share the student's communication mode. It's critical for language development, for social interaction, and for academic language and academic learning. So IEP's teams must consider all these areas and where students have the opportunity for direct instruction and the language communication mode when appropriate. So when you think about your academic settings, is this happening? And how will this be executed moving forward? So the statute also references existing federal law for students who are blind or visually impaired. Specifically, IEP teams have to consider Braille instruction or the use of Braille unless the team determines after evaluation and appropriate evaluation by qualified assessors that Braille is not appropriate for a student. And that should be looked at consistently throughout the child's educational career. So the key takeaways from this section is Ed Code, that access to language and communication is central to the educational program. Inclusive education must mean that the students have meaningful communication access, opportunities for interaction, and appropriate instructional supports. So while the statutory language is detailed, the core message is clear. Inclusion and LRE must include and ensure full communication and language access to our students. So slide 7, the section of the law refers and references the federal guidance stating that meeting communication needs of students who are deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind is fundamental to providing a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. In other words, communication access is not a supplemental consideration, but a core educational requirement. And the guidance also clarifies that placement decisions need to be based on what FAPE is, the free and appropriate public education for individual students. And the IEP team must carefully consider what environment allows the student to receive appropriate services, while also ensuring access to communication and instruction. And more importantly, and we see this happen often, the LRE determination should only occur after the IEP team has fully developed the student's program. LRE does not always mean the student is placed alone in a general education setting. In other words, the team must first identify the student's full range of needs, their strengths, their services, and then determine the appropriate placement that can meet that student's needs. So again, it reinforces that LRE is not simply about physical placement, but it's about whether the environment truly supports the student's ability to learn, to communicate, and to fully participate. And finally, this section highlights the importance of including educational partner input. It includes perspectives from individuals who are deaf, who are hard of hearing, who might be deaf-blind, as well as organizations and experts who work closely with these communities. We have to incorporate these perspectives to help ensure that policies and practice reflect lived experience and best practice for supporting students, all students. So think about what your program is or where your program is and who you can reach out to gain input, insight, and support. So a key takeaway in the overarching message of this section of the law is that communication access, thoughtful placement decisions, and collaborations with stakeholders or educational partners are essential to providing meaningful access to our students. Next slide, please. This section of statute emphasizes, again, the critical role our parents play in decision-making for their children. Are they at the seat, at the table for every discussion and every decision? Because remember, their voice must be respected through that IEP process. Parents also and often know more about our children than we know, regardless of the time that we spend with them during the school day. So again, the statute talks about looking at the student's language development, communication learning needs, and again, very important, social engagement. The law also requires teams consider the student's academic progress. It ensures that placement and services are not only supporting communication access, but results in meaningful academic outcomes. Another key point here is recognizing that parents and guardians have the depth knowledge and deep knowledge of their child's needs. Like I said before, families often provide more important insights into their child's communication preferences, their learning needs, their strengths, how they function at home, and these perspectives all need to be included in the decision making. And finally, the statute emphasizes meaningful participation by parents, effective educational planning to make sure there's true partnerships with families. And we know that when families are actively involved and their perspectives are respected, teams are better able to design programs that meet the full needs of our students. So in addition to focusing on the communication access and appropriate placement, the statute also reminds us that strong collaboration with families is essential to providing meaningful education and opportunities for students. The next slide talks about the focus really being on what IEP and IFSP teams must do when determining least restrictive environment for students who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. The law requires teams to do two things when making these placement decisions. First, we must consider the student's language and communication needs, and we have to carefully consider these needs and looking at the student's preferred language or their communication mode. Are they using spoken language? Are they using spoken English, ASL, cued speech, communication devices, Braille? All of these options must be considered in the IEP process. We also need to look at opportunities for direct communication with peers and professionals. We have to look at the students' academic levels and opportunities for direct instruction in the student's primary language and communication mode. So the key point here is that placement decisions cannot be made without fully considering whether the student will have a meaningful access to communication and instruction. The statute also emphasizes the importance of direct communication with peers and professionals who share the student's communication. It's also important because language development, social interaction, and academic learning are all closely connected. Students must have the opportunity to interact, to learn, and to communicate naturally within their educational environment. Think of a student who's fully included with a sign language interpreter alone. What opportunities do they have to directly communicate with their peers? What about incidental learning? Learning from side conversations in their students' language of choice. So the second requirement is that teams must review the full range of placement and service options available to students. It includes options such as programs within a school district, county offices or regional programs, non-public schools or agencies, and specialized programs such as the California Schools for the Deaf and the California School for the Blind. So the intent is to ensure that teams fully explore the range of available supports and placements that may best meet the needs of students. So again, the key takeaway is that overall, the message in this section is that LRE decisions must be thoughtful and individualized, with a strong focus on language access, communication, and the student's ability to meaningfully participate in language. So, as we've seen throughout the statute, one consistent theme is educational access for students is deeply connected to language, communication, and sensory access. So before we move forward, it's helpful to take a step back and to look at these unique considerations for providing FAPE for students who are deaf, hard of hearing, deafblind, or blind. So the next slide summarizes some of those key considerations that the teams must keep in mind. I believe you're already there. So now that we've already gone through the statutory language, here's just a brief slide that summarizes what it means for teams when making placement decisions for students who are deaf, hard of hearing, deafblind, or blind. The key point is LRE decisions for these students must include additional considerations. The first responsibility of the team is to carefully evaluate the student's language and communication needs. And my question is, who is doing this evaluation in your school districts and your programs? And are they highly qualified to do this evaluation? So again, the key consideration is whether students have meaningful access in this proposed setting. Teams should ask questions such as, does the student have direct access to instruction in their language? Are there opportunities for communications with peers and adults who share that language? And is the environment structured so that students can participate fully, socially, and academically? The law also emphasizes direct instruction and communication access. Again, we talked about qualified staff, qualified interpreters, and they are essential to students' learning. So without these supports, a placement may appear inclusive, but is not actually providing meaningful access. You might also hear the term critical mass. This refers to having enough peers who share a communication mode so that students have authentic opportunities for social action, interaction, language development, and peer learning. For many students, this is an important factor when determining whether a placement truly meets their needs. The second major requirement is the team must consider the full continuum of placement options. That includes options such as district programs, county and regional programs, the California School for the Deaf or Blind, certified non-public schools, and other approved placements. And the goal is to ensure your teams fully know what these options are before making a placement decision. So if you don't know about the options in your area, please reach out to your SELPA administrator. If you don't know who that is, you can also reach out to CDE, and we can help you get the support you need for your schools to support your child. So remember, knowledge is power. It's also important to remember that the removal of a student from a gen ed setting should only occur when appropriate supports cannot meet the student's needs. That is completely the IEP team's decision. And we have to remember and focus, we always have to look at the unique needs of each student when we determine their LRE. So when we talk about least restrictive environment for students who are deaf, hard of hearing, deaf, blind, or blind, the key question is not simply where the student is placed, but whether the environment truly provides access to communication, to language development, and learning. So ultimately, the least restrictive environment for students who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf, blind, or many of our students is not just about the physical setting. It's about whether the environment truly provides access to language, to communication, to instruction, to peer interaction, and more. Remember, the law reinforces that teams must look carefully at instructional supports and the full continuum of placement options so that a student does receive access to a free and appropriate public education. So with that foundation in mind, and you have the legal language on the slides, to help bring this policy to practice, I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Nancy Leibach-Ammann, who will walk us through the practical implications of these requirements and what it means for IEP teams and local agencies as they make placement and service decisions for our students. Nancy?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Rachel Heenan, for giving that explanation. That is most difficult when it comes to understanding the technical portions of the statute itself and the legalities and what that means for us working at the schools. You know, we have so many different types of schools here in California that serve different purposes. We have local school districts, we have county offices, we have school for the deaf, school for the blind, charter schools, non-public schools. So many different types of schools that we work with. But they are all expected to serve deaf and hard of hearing students. I really want to create great emphasis on deaf and hard of hearing and not being exclusive of every other deaf identity, right? Deaf and hard of hearing is an umbrella term, and that incorporates deaf blind, deaf plus, deaf, disabled. It really includes all of those identities. And our goal here is looking at communication and communication practices as it applies to the law. Now, when it comes to language appropriate placement, FAPE, we have to think about a student, and when we receive the student, we need to establish an IEP team. And based on our assessments and our evaluations of that child and their language and communication needs, these things should not be assumed. All of these should be based on data from the IEP team. This should be a transparent report, and then we can make a decision with appropriate placement and making sure that we are meeting the student's needs. So communication needs are the priority, and that is a part of the IEP. Also looking at the level of performance as well as other portions of the IEP, which would include assessments as well. Looking at opportunities of direct communication with staff members and peers, whether this be American Sign Language or spoken English. It really looks at where that student feels they can accomplish the most uh, in their setting. And we want to focus on achievement and build on that. So, direct communication, whether this be through teacher to student communication or through a sign language interpreter, is this sign language interpreter competent to facilitate this type of communication? What kind of communication is happening between the student and the teacher? Also, looking at the environment, the full range of supports that are necessary. The student will gain from all of the different supports in place, and they will be able to make progress in the classroom based on the resources that are provided. Again, that need for direct instruction in that student's preferred language. Students are successful when they have direct communication with their teacher without any other support, say interpreters, aides, also ACCs, things like that. We have to look at the whole environment and the whole approach when it comes to that. Now, when you do have these discussions, please be mindful of the key players involved. Are there deaf and hard of hearing people involved? Deaf disabled, deaf plus individuals? Who is involved in these team decisions, and who are the experts in the deaf education field, as well as nonprofit organizations that you work with closely in your neighboring districts? Are you working with the state special schools, charter schools, public schools, county offices of education, as well as the folks who should be a part of the IEP team are parents and guardians, and their input is definitely necessary. It's very important. We need to have that home perspective of what the parents are seeing with that child at home. The child may sign more at school and use spoken English at home, or it could be the other way around. Regardless, we want to ensure that we are making progress with that student and they are having meaningful participation at school. And it requires the whole IEP team to make that appropriate placement based on assessments, evaluations, and progress. And these would be both formal and informal assessments. Now, I really want to talk about policy to practice and language and communication needs and what it looks like in practice. Oftentimes the student's primary language on the IEP is checked off, and a lot of times these accommodations are placed for that primary language. Now, the language is essential because they access their education through language. Say the student speaks Spanish and they're fluent in Spanish. We need to check that off as the primary language. We have to be aware of their primary language. We can't have a secondary language and have the accommodations be based on that secondary language. Core instruction fluency is critical for that student's language development, and they cannot only solely be providing interpreting services to meet that language goal. And it's really there to support that communication between the teacher and the student. And a lot of students do benefit from interpreting services, and many don't. Again, it goes back to the IEP team and how they're making decisions when they look at the whole child and all of the variables that are included for that student. As for communication access, this really looks at different areas. It's not only in the classroom, but it's from the moment you leave home as a child, when you get on the bus or when you get to school. Once you enter the school, what does that look like from the moment you get onto campus or any school setting? Once you get into the classroom, that student sits down at their desk. They have access to the communication environment, what's happening in the classroom? Do they only have access to the teacher? Do they have access to group sessions, recess, lunch, assemblies, PE, art, music, sports, all of these different electives? Are they being included? Do they have an interpreter placed with them for the entire day? Or are they placed in a program with critical mass with other students who share the same language? Do public schools have a large number of deaf students that they can interact with? Or are they only the only deaf child? Or are they joining another school? We have to look at the continuum of services. That is so key because no one is better than the other, right? They're all important, but it really depends on that student and how they can succeed and what's best for them, and which program is the best fit for that student. And this is for language access. Now, language access is treated as a instructional foundation, right? And it's not just for the sake of the student. It should be all day in a public school setting or general ed setting. They should have access to all language that's happening around them. What makes deaf students different is they have another language that they use, or there may be additional supports in place to support their language. Now, the LRE decisions for deafblind students, this really requires a team decision for placement. You have to consider an array of things. You need to evaluate the student's language and communication needs, considering communication access, direct instruction in the student's language, opportunities for communication with peers and professionals. Peers and professionals and how those differ is as a student, how I socialize with other students, those are my peers, but also my relationships with my teachers, my school administrators, my support staff that are in place for me. We don't want to create a feeling of isolation. And also looking at critical mass, the large number of students with shared identity. Say one school has 10 students at the same site. They're able to develop those social skills and that emotional well-being because they're able to socialize. They don't have to rely on interpreters to interpret it for peer-to-peer interaction. Just as a general ed student, we want them to experience the same. We want to consider all placement options. We, again, all options. We don't want to leave out any option available. This would include local school districts, schools for the deaf, schools for the blind, county offices of education, or regional programs, non-public schools that are certified or approved placements. We want to look at all options before we make a decision on where to place the student. As for direct communication and beyond the placement, a deaf student that's placed in a general ed classroom, they may have an interpreter and they have a class where multiple peers utilize ASL. They have access to deaf adults or deaf and hard of hearing staff during the school day. This would be a practical example. Now, Teams would ask what could be done differently or what could be in addition to this. Let's look into this here. Can the student communicate directly without an interpreter mediating that language? Uh, can they communicate without that interpreter or an aid? Is that student socially isolated despite being included? Maybe during group work sessions or specific center activities, they may be in the same room as other peers, but they're not actually engaging in conversation. You need to look into that. Just because they're physically there in the same room doesn't necessarily mean they feel included. We have to keep our eye out for those students and their social progress. The key concept here is physical inclusion does not mean communication inclusion. Being present in a room does not necessarily mean you're being included. We have to look at the big picture here when it comes to that student's progress in the classroom. So, critical mass in real terms means instead of placing a single deaf student at a neighborhood school, the district would offer a cluster model at one site. Maybe it is a large school district with many neighboring schools, and there are deaf students spread out through those schools, say in a 10-mile radius. Instead of having those students isolated in these other schools, they would bring them together to create critical mass. Say kindergarten has 3 or 4 deaf students, first grade would have 3 or 4 more deaf students. That would become that critical mass that's necessary. And the teachers that work with them have the ability to communicate directly with those students without an interpreter involved. Using shared language, this could be any language, whether it's spoken English or ASL or cued speech, whatever the case may be, as long as they're able to communicate directly. Another example is if a child comes from a Spanish-speaking family, that's another additional consideration that we would consider as well, incorporating both Spanish and ASL. We don't want that student to feel isolated, and we don't want to put the burden on the student to take on that isolation. And oftentimes, isolated students would rely solely on the interpreter for any communication access. And that does burden the interpreter to provide all of that environmental knowledge that hearing students just have access to. And interpreters have to fill in the gap for all incidental learning that's happening at all times throughout the day, not only in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom, because hearing students still access that information, but that solo deaf student isn't picking up with that information. So they become reliant on that interpreter to access the environment around them. Now, LRE decision making. The standard question is, can the student be supported in general education? I really want to reframe this thought. AB 1938, this question really boils down to, can the student receive direct instruction and communication in that setting? That is the question the IEP team needs to ask themselves and ask each other. An example here, say the student is academically capable in a general education setting, but no staff use the student's primary language, and peer communication is limited. So the team would need to explore options like California School for the Deaf, California School for the Blind, district deaf and hard of hearing programs, or regional programs before defaulting to general education with supports. And these supports would include interpreting services, note-taking services. We need to look at the long-term impacts of this child being placed in general education with supports and how they can succeed. The key concept here is LRE is about access, not just proximity. So, implementation and key takeaways. So, myself, Rachel, and CDE, we are communicating these new requirements to all LEAs, district offices, county offices. We communicated all this information before July 1st, 2025. The goal of this is not to create new rights, but it reinforces and clarifies existing free appropriate public education and LRE requirements under federal law and IDEA. The bottom line here is AB 1938 reinforces that language access is essential and IEP teams to actively consider direct communication, direct instruction, and the full range of placements for deaf and hard of hearing students. Okay, so I would like to start us off with a poll. If we could go ahead and send out that poll, great. Go ahead and answer away. Okay, we could move on. So that is the right answer. Good job, folks. You're really paying attention to this presentation, which I so appreciate. I want all of us to have the same shared understanding that it does apply to all. All right, we will have our next question. I'll read the question. When involving or respecting input and choice of parents and guardians, which of the following must be included in the IEP process? A. Consideration of the pupil's language development. B. Consideration of the pupil's academic progress. C. Consideration of the parent's guardian's knowledge of the child's unique needs. D. Meaningful participation and documentation in the development of the IEP IFSP. E. All of the above. So the answer would be all of the above. Ed code 56040.6, Parenthium 9, A through D. Okay, last question. Okay, what's the answer? So FAPE is individually determined based on the unique needs of each student. There is no such thing as one size fits all people. That is the key language here. And I also want to make sure that you are aware it's so essential that we always look at, based on poll question number 2, we have to be considerate of the students' language development, academic progress, and the parents' knowledge of that child's unique needs and documentation of development. All of those key aspects should be considered before you make that determination of placement, because we want to ensure that we accommodate that student's needs and goals, looking at the whole child so they can succeed. This is critical, and this is something that should be considered every time you work with a student. All right, thank you so much, Dr. Heenan, if you could join me on screen.
So we just wanted to express from both of us our gratitude for all of you for joining this webinar today. We know that it's a hard time at the end of the day, but this is such important information. Again, if there are more questions, our email addresses are on the bottom of the page. Feel free to reach out to us anytime. We're here to provide you support and connect you to make sure that we have success for all our students. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for valuing every deaf student we serve in California.